What we've got up on the screen hopefully is the start of quite a number of verses that hopefully I'll be able to show you there, and will save us, because we're going to do a lot of verse by verse in following Lot's life, rather than having to look up and down all the time. Hopefully we can just look up and see it there before us and hopefully make the flow a little bit easier. That's the intention anyway, so I hope it works. Well, the life of Lot is characterised by choices. Some good, some bad. And of course, as we go through his life, we'll see that there's always consequences from whatever choice we make. Now that sounds very much like us and our lives, doesn't it? So, as David reminded us, certainly we can put ourselves in these sort of positions and know that God has left these people's lives on record for us, so that hopefully we make more good choices than bad ones. And of course, this is clearly laid out in the life of Lot. And it's recorded for our consideration and hopefully our ultimate benefit. Now, the story actually begins in Genesis 11, where the line of Shem is given, leading to Abraham and Lot. Now, we'll see if this works. So it looks like it does. Good. And here we have three significant sons of Terah. We have Abraham, Nahor and Haran mentioned. Now, it's important in the following story that these three names are given. Now, Nahor finds a place because of Rebecca in the future stories, and Haran finds a place here because of Lot, of which we see some of his life in the foregoing chapters. Now, we should note at the start that Abram is not necessarily the oldest of the sons. He's mentioned first because in God's word he is preeminent and his story has much more in it than the other two. And there are other occasions where this is also seen in Genesis 10:21. It shows also the same sort of thing. Names are mentioned first because of the preeminence, not necessarily because they're the oldest son. So in 11:26, we see that at 20 years of age, Terah had the first of three sons, which was probably Haran. Then verse 27, we're told there that Haran became the father of Lot. Now, Haran seems to have been the eldest, and consequently to his death, it appears as though his two brothers marry. We see in Genesis 11, verse 30, that just a little verse right at the end of the chapter, that Sarah was barren and she had no children. It almost seems, when you just read it where it is, it just seems to be a little out of place. Yes, Sarah was childless. But there was a nephew, Lot, who had lost his father not long before. And so Lot becomes, it seems, the adopted son of Abram and of Sarai. And of course, that brings up an interesting point of comparing timelines of Abram and Lot. And I tried very hard through all the information I could get to try to get a timeline, and it was very hard to get one that seemed to follow through with everything. But it seems, don't take this as is, but it seems as though Abraham was only maybe 15 to 20 years older than Lot. Take that as it is. But they were reasonably close in age. And doing that, I had to work backwards from the death of Terah and the second call for Abram, because there we got specific ages given in Scripture. And we find there that the age gap between Abram and Lot could not have been, therefore, very great. Like I say, maybe 20 years for the time Abraham to marry, and for Sarah to be called childless, and for Abram to take Lot under his wing. Now, for the rest of the recorded life of Lot, the influence of Abram is marked. And that's where the choices bit really comes in. So somewhere between, in chapter 11, between verses 29 and 30, God speaks to Abram and commands him to move to another country, foreign to him, as we're told in Acts 7, 2-4. God appeared to our father Abram while he was still in Mesopotamia, before he lived in Haran. God said, and I've abbreviated some of these to fit in the picture. God said, "Leave your country and your people." So he left and settled in Haran. Now, we're told then that in verse 31, Genesis 11:31, Terah took Abram should be still, Lot and Sarah, and together they set out from Ur to go to Canaan. But when they got to Haran, they settled there. Now, it seems as though Terah, as the head of the house, takes the motivation that Abram's going to go anyway. Well, Terah is the head of the family. I'll go too, and Lot will go with us, and we'll go on our way to Canaan. The move is not one of faith for Terah, but Abraham and Lot go together, and Lot appears, at the start anyway, to make a choice to go with his adopted father and see that as a good move. And they all had the intention to go to Canaan. But the city of Haran is familiar territory. And the whole family, Abraham, Lot, Terah, and whoever they had with them, settle in Haran. Now, settling in Haran is not the rest stop it should have been. It should have been just a rest stop on their way to Canaan. But they settled there. And here we note that Ur and Haran are very much the same. Familiar territory to Terah, familiar territory to Abraham and Lot too. For the two cities were idol worshippers of the moon god, and initially, as we're told in Joshua 24, 2-3, that Abraham was as well. Long ago your forefathers, says Joshua, including Terah, the father of Abraham, lived beyond the river and worshipped other gods. So it wasn't unfamiliar territory in stopping at Haran and staying there. It wasn't a good choice for the whole three of them and all that were with them. For Abram as well. The partial move was probably tempered by family ties to Abraham at this point. He had yet to be able to sever the ties with his father-in-law and all those others of his family that moved with him. Interesting in trying to work out the length of journey, just an interesting little thing that maybe not thought of, how long it might have taken us. The journey between Ur and the first stop at Haran wasn't overly far, but it's very hard to work out exactly where Ur was. I read up a lot about it, and probably some of you here tonight will know a lot more than I've been able to find. But it was first believed that the Ur of Abram and Lot was in southern Mesopotamia, on the western side of the river Euphrates, where that person called Woolley, you've all have heard of him, unearthed a city that he believed was Ur. But Joshua tells us that Ur was beyond the river, that is, on the eastern side of the river. And in Acts 7:2, Stephen mentions Mesopotamia as the dwelling place of Abram before he moves. So in Old Testament times, Mesopotamia refers to a very large area of the upper part of the Tigris-Euphrates Valley. So the journey could have been 6 weeks, or to Haran, or the journey could have only maybe been 8 days. The difference between the two geographical areas, just for interest, was between 960 k's or 150 k's. Don't know which it was, it doesn't really matter, but just a little bit of interesting stuff along the way. The point is, Abram may have left his hometown, but he wasn't a stranger to the present habitational location where they stopped at Haran. Lot was with him. Lot was quite willing at this time to go along with his adopted family. Interesting point. did Abram at this early stage, after receiving those promises, and Sarai being barren, did he see Lot as a son through whom the promises would come? Just a thought along the way. Genesis 11:32. We're told that Terah lived 205 years and he died in Haran. And then we get Genesis 12:4 and 5. Abram left as the Lord had told him, even though he'd stopped along the way, and Lot went with him. And Abram was 75 years old. They set out for the land of Canaan and they arrived there. So at the death of Terah, there's the second intervention by God and the motivation to uproot now and leave the rest of his family there in Haran from the settled life that they had taken up to become a stranger and a pilgrim living in tents. So they come out of the city into maybe a smaller city in Haran, and now they will become strangers and pilgrims wandering towards that land of Canaan, well to the south, and living in tents. That's a bit ahead, so we'll just go back on that one. Right. The stay in Haran had been prosperous for them all, for the whole family, Lot included. For what it's worth, the Jews believed that they stayed in Haran for 5 years. Now, from what I could work out, Lot would now be about 55 years old and well able to make his own decisions to whether he was going to leave Haran and go with Abram, his adopted father, on this long journey to who knows where, or stay in a familiar place. So he makes a good choice at this point in his life, doesn't he? He goes with Abram. And probably at this point in time we can say that his belief in the God of Abraham and his promises was his belief. I'm sure Abram would have talked a lot to him about it, and he was not just following along. So he had a faith of his own at this point in his life. Just think about it. To leave your hometown, your country, and now the rest of your family was a big thing for a still young man at 55 to do, as it was, of course, for Abram as well. But a little bit different for Lot, because the promises were made directly to Abram and only the thoughts and promises were only passed on to Lot. So he had to make a conscious decision, a conscious choice. So they went. They set out for the land of Canaan and they arrived there. The good part was now the intention was to go. No big stops on the way. And they did. And they get to Shechem as their first major stop, and it was a 650k journey. And God shows his approval by appearing to Abram again at this point. And there, God is honoured by Abram building an altar for him. And again, a little later, when they move to Bethel, again, Abram builds an altar. And I think we can be pretty sure and say that Lot took part in the building of that and very much in the worship of God in those two times. So far, Lot's life with Abram had been blessed with plenty. But now we find they're faced with a famine. Decision time for Lot. Does Lot see this as God leaving them and so turn back, as he very well could have done? He made a choice that no, the promises that God made, that God is faithful, he will carry them out and he'll be with us regardless. So we find that he continues with Abram. And Abram, Lot and all their families and all their goods, they go down into Egypt. Now, I'm going to ask Brendan to read just in a second Genesis 13 verses 1 to 13, because this is them coming up out of Egypt where some big choices are to be made. Thanks, Brent.
Reading then the first 13 verses of chapter 13. So Abram went up from Egypt, he and his wife, and all that he had, and Lot with him, into the Negev. Now Abraham was very rich in livestock, in silver and in gold, and he sojourned on from the Negev as far as Bethel to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the place where he had made an altar at the first. And there Abram called upon the name of the Lord, and Lot, who went with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents, so that the land could not support both of them dwelling together, for their possessions were so great that they could not dwell together. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. At that time the Canaanites and the Perizzites were dwelling in the land. And Abram said to Lot, "Let there be no strife between you and me, and between your herdsmen and my herdsmen, for we are kinsmen. Is not the whole land before you? Separate yourself from me. If you take to the left hand, then I'll go to the right, or if you take the right hand, then I'll go to the left." Excuse me, it's faded out. And Lot lifted up his eyes and saw that the Jordan Valley was well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, in the direction of Zoar. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself all the Jordan Valley, and Lot journeyed east. Thus they separated from each other. Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled among the cities of the valley and moved his tent as far as Sodom. Now the men of Sodom were wicked, great sinners against the Lord.
Thanks, Brenton, for that reading. It brought to my mind when I read that first off, in the situation that they were now in. The quote that we know very well: "Seek ye first the kingdom of God, and all these other things will be added unto you." Abram's riches coming out of Egypt were not only riches in herds and cattle and goods, but his riches were founded on spiritual riches. That was because of the direct contact he had via vision with God, and of course it gave him the impetus to believe and to follow. Whereas, I don't know if it's the right word, but Lot's belief was in some ways piggybacked, because his wasn't a direct vision from God upon Abram's. But he still was called a faithful and righteous man, as we know. But that left him vulnerable. And this became very clear in that reading that Brenton gave for us, the next phase of his life. So far, he has faithfully made choices and followed Abram wherever he has gone, believing that God was with him and believing what God had told he would do for Abram. But here, possessions become a sticking point. It's not personal, not a personal sticking point, just practical, that they should separate. Now we note that so far Lot's choices have been good, and he's been blessed along with Abram. Verses 8 and 9, Abram said to Lot, "Let's not quarrel, for we are brothers. Is not the whole land before you? Let's part company." Now personally, they'd obviously got on reasonably well in their travelling together and with the hassles that they had down in Egypt. We are brethren. So they're brethren not only with family ties, but they were brethren because of their common belief in the promises made by God to Abram. They were spiritually related as well as physically so. Are we always able to make the proper decisions from the heart or from the head? Same with Lot as with us. And sometimes when the heart overrules the head, then we can go in wrong ways. So he suggests that, well, we should part company. And he suggests to him that we can go whichever way you would like to go. It's your choice. My choice. 1 Timothy 6, 9 and 17. People who want to get rich fall into temptation and a trap that plunge men into ruin and destruction. Put not your hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but put your hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. Well, there's a choice. The funny thing about it, I feel, is when we read those verses, 8 and 9, there was no argument at all. Lot didn't say, oh, but Abram, you're the senior in this family. You make the choice, and whatever you think is best for me, I will follow that. Abram doesn't do that. He puts it on Lot to make the choice. And I suppose by that time in his life, it was the right thing to do in that Lot was certainly old enough and should have been wise enough to make his own choice, though it would have been good if he'd asked the advice of Abram. Now, as we read there's no pretense at all when Lot makes his choice. It reads, he didn't say, you make the decision, I'll go along with it. It doesn't do that. He seems immediately to fall in with what Abram suggests. His proposal that, if you go east, I'll go west, you go down there, I'll stay up here, whatever it might be. He almost seems to think, look down, I've got a lot of herds. And that was a problem caused between Abram's men and my men. His wealth, as Timothy said there a moment ago, now possessed him rather than the other way around. And this appears to be the first major test of his faith. And he lost badly. The choice he made didn't seem, in his eyes at all, to be a bad choice. He didn't maybe not know what Sodom and Gomorrah and those cities of the valley were like. Possibly not. But making the choice by sight, going away from Abram, his strength, not seeking advice, and the thoughts of looking at that lush valley where his herds could become bigger with no problems, blinded him to everything else. At this point of separation from the immediate source of his blessings in Abram, seems to have been forgotten entirely by him. He seems to have forgotten that being with Abram, God's chosen man, he had been blessed with him. And now he separates himself quite willingly, thinking that, well, if I go down there, I can get bigger herds anyway. Just a little picture of Abram and Lot overlooking the plains and up on the hilly country where the herds would have had a hard job finding not only water but feed, and looking down on the valley. He sees it with his eyes wide open and sees, well, that's where I'm going to go. Got a bit ahead of myself there, but anyway, I'll leave it. In verse 10 of chapter 13, before the destruction of those cities of the valley, before the Dead Sea existed, we're told that it was just a well-watered valley. very appealing to a herdsman. And like that one of Abraham and Lot we just showed, they're probably looking at the high hills overlooking the valley, and they can see the expanse of it, and you can almost imagine Lot's eyes lighting up and think, oh yes, that looks good. The cities are of no consequence to him at this time, but he made a decision and he was going to go with it. It says in there about, the paraphrase almost of talking about the Garden of Eden, and I'll paraphrase what happened in the Garden of Eden to the position of Lot and see what you think. When Lot saw that the valley could carry greater herds, that the ambience was desirable rather than the harsher country of Bethel, and that it would enhance his state as a standalone rich lord, sounds very much like Genesis, doesn't it? He chose all the plain of Jordan. Yes. Proverbs 22, a good name is more desirable than riches. A prudent man sees danger and takes refuge, but the simple keeps going and suffer for it. And didn't he? So verse 11 tells us that Lot, with all his herd and his retinue, they journey east, they separate themselves from his faithful mentor, and so we have these words in Proverbs. Genesis 13, 12 to 13. Abram lived in the land of Canaan, while Lot lived among the cities of the plain and pitched his tent near Sodom. Now the men of Sodom were wicked and were sinning greatly against the Lord. Now the inference here is that the physical and eventual spiritual separation of Abraham and Lot brought him to pitch his tent close enough to Sodom, maybe at the first as under the protection of a city, rather than just living out in the open plain. He was now on his own, without the feeling of protection of Abraham and the God with him. So he pitches his tent not with the initial thought of living in Sodom, but just pitch his tent near it, maybe for the fact of, well, he felt a little bit more comfortable being near a group of people. Maybe he thought, when he'd spoken to the people, maybe he just deceived. I think he may have been, well, maybe I can witness to these people here that there is a God and I believe in him, etc. But sadly, it wasn't Lot's choice that led his heart astray. His heart was already astray. And it was demonstrated by the choice that he made without thinking about any consequences that might come from it. Of course, the words, now the men of Sodom are wicked, etc., is the comment that the writer makes at God's inspiration. At that time, Lot would not have known the extent of their wickedness. 14, 12 and 16. Now, the story then moves on to chapter 14, and Lot is now living in the city. He's left his tent outside of Sodom and he's bought a house within the walls, and he's settled in quite comfortably, thank you. And inadvertently, he finds himself involved in a local war between some warlords. And he, with all his goods, his family, and with all the people of Sodom and all their goods, are taken away. And the interesting part about this is that God then intervenes in Lot's life. And through Abraham, and Abraham gets his group of people together, plus a couple of other kings, and he brings Lot and the people of Sodom and all their goods back to the city again. Goods, family, intact. Nothing happened to them. Nothing happened physically except the worry of getting taken away. Does he take this as a warning? Does he listen to Abram's warnings that I feel would have been given? Because he would have been there when that's the situation of the Melchizedek and the things that were given back to the people of Sodom, etc. Abram would have taken him aside, I'm sure, and said, look, it's not the best place for you to be, Lot. This is the kind of thing that's going to happen time and time again. But sadly, no. He makes another choice, one that led to another choice and led to another choice, and so it went on. He's now embedded in the city and its society. And city life has become pretty comfortable rather than the herdsman, not living in a tent anymore, living in a house. And even the godlessness around him, it was living like that was more appealing than living in tents and wandering on rocky hillsides. Matthew 6:19-21. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And sadly, his heart now was where he was living. For the next decade or so, Lot lives among a godless and wicked people. And there are two interesting quotes that pertain to this part of his life. And I think we've got one in Peter. 2 Peter 2, verse 7. God rescued Lot, a righteous man, who was distressed by the filthy lives of lawless men. Living among them day after day, was tormented in his righteous soul by the lawless deeds he saw and heard. God rescued Lot, a righteous man. So even though he had made these wrong choices and put himself in a very bad position, one that was going to be testing his faith day after day, as we see from those words, he was still deemed to be righteous in God's eyes. Maybe because he was doing what he thought he would do in the first place, trying to be an example to the ungodly men that he was now embedded within. But as we know, because they were lawless and godless in every way, God intervened and destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, but we know that he saved Lot, who regarded him there as just and righteous. Now the other one is in Luke chapter 10, verses 10 and 12, where again Lot is mentioned. It's talking about the situation where the apostles preached with the authority of Jesus and had the power of the Holy Spirit with them, and when they preached, they could show that God was with them by the things that they could do in healing people, etc. But as we know, largely the message of the apostles was rejected. And in Luke 10, Jesus leaves you the impression that he says that if, considering that Lot preached without any signs, and even though his message was rejected and the wrath of God fell upon Sodom, what do you think is going to happen to all these people when they have the word of God through the apostles and power preached? What's God's wrath going to be upon them? Of course, it will be not only like Sodom and Gomorrah, but it will be utter destruction. There are two quotes in the Old Testament, one in Isaiah and one in Ezekiel. I'm not sure which one I've got on here. Yes, Ezekiel, this one, Ezekiel 4:9-15. I've abbreviated a fair bit, but it's just likening Jerusalem at the time of Isaiah and the time of Ezekiel to Sodom. Now, this was a sin of your sister Sodom, so they almost say Jerusalem and Sodom are sisters, which is nothing to have said. They were haughty, did detestable things before me, therefore I did away with them. And that's a description of a completely decadent society. They took pride in the abominable things that they practiced. And Isaiah does the same, describes Jerusalem like Sodom, who flaunted their wickedness and was shameless in their wickedness. Any thought of Abram by Lot now, sadly, I think, has probably waned. Lot appears to think that his lifestyle, godly to agree, will somehow influence the city dwellers in Sodom. We know that he was soon to find out that was a very unwise choice. We find that he's now seated in the gate. So there appears to be a steady progression within his life, from going down from the mountains with God, we might say, down to the valley. He pitches his tent near Sodom. He buys a house in Sodom. He's living in Sodom quite comfortably, and maybe even working in amongst the people of Sodom. And there's two lines of thought in that, and I'll just say them first. Sitting in the gate. Two thoughts. One involves maybe he had some civic position, as sitting in the gate seems to say in lots of places. You sat in the gate as a kind of magistrate or one who worked things out for people. And of course that was thrown in his face by the people of Sodom when they came to his door, as we'll see in a moment. The other thought is that because he knew the wickedness of the people, he knew how travellers were treated by the inhabitants, and so he maybe sat in the gate to get to the travellers first before others could take them to their house, and so maybe, in his eyes, give them a safe haven. Now, there are three quotes talking about the movement of Lot, from up in the hills, down to the plain, outside the city, in the city. Psalm 1, 1 and 2. Blessed is the man who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked, or stand in the way of sinners, or sits in the seat of mockers, but his delight is in the law of the Lord. Right, you know this one very well. Genesis 3:6. When the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eye and desirable for gaining wisdom, she took some of it and ate it. And Psalm 26, 4, 5. I do not sit with deceitful men. I abhor the assembly of evildoers and refuse to sit with the wicked. That last one, of course, is a very positive one by the psalmist. But Lot had made compromises in his life. His choices had brought him into the position of making compromises, and maybe not realising that he was, simply because of the choices he had made. But because of that, Lot was to lose almost everything. He's to lose all his possessions. His herds appear to have been long gone. Some commentators suggest he'd sold his herds and didn't want to be a herdsman anymore, and that's why he was living in the city. He was quite happy to be part of the city, be that as it may. But he was going to lose almost everything. Well, the next part of this story, these two men come and he meets them and he invites them to his house and going to show hospitality to them and give them a bed for the night and protect them, probably. So the thoughts that follow in verses 4 and 9 of the next chapter, we're not going to talk about it all. You know the story well. It's a very sad story, saying about how the inhabitants of that place were so utterly depraved and evil that there was no reason that God would not destroy them, and that Lot had to be taken out. And this, of course, was a blessing from God that Abraham had prayed for. So we find them in the house, and then there's people beating at the door, saying to bring the men out. Lot himself goes out to try to appease them, and he's now threatened with violence himself. He gets pulled in to the door, and the door is shut, and he is saved. In Genesis 19, 9, 11, this is what the people say when he tries to appease them. This fellow came here as an alien, and now he wants to play the judge. But the men inside reached out and pulled Lot back into the house and shut the door. Then they struck the men who were at the door of the house, young and old, with blindness. Now, surely Lot would have realised the way he was saved and what happened to those people that were at the door, noisily beating it down, and all of a sudden they couldn't find the door and wandered away. Surely he would have realised these men were more than mere mortal men. They weren't just two travellers. They were men of God. Now, if we're in that situation, don't you think that you would suddenly realise that is a very bad position I'm in, they have saved me, what do I do next? He gets told that God is going to destroy the place and that they are there to take him and all that he can take, with all his family that are willing to come with him, out and then to be destroyed. Do you think being told that would bring a change in his thinking? When there's going to be just impending destruction of all that he had, his house, all his goods that he accumulated? It doesn't appear so. Lot is pulled back in the door and he's saved. Genesis 19, 15 and 16. Morning comes. Very early in the morning. Lot appears to need to be dragged out of his bed. With the coming of dawn, verse 15 and 16, the angels urge Lot, saying, "Hurry, take your wife and your daughters, or you'll be swept away when the city is punished." When he hesitated, the men grasped the hands of Lot, his wife and his two daughters, and led them safely out of the city. Come on, hurry, Lot, get out of bed. It doesn't appear though the urging had much effect at all. The city is going to be destroyed utterly, completely. He became connected to the place. He was almost saying, will God really destroy all these people? Oh, no, they're wicked. Are they that wicked that God would utterly destroy them all? I call that the rose-coloured glasses syndrome. And no godly person can ever afford to fall into that state of mind. He's reluctant there, as we see in verse 16. He hesitates. He has to be dragged out of bed, but he still hesitates when, come on, you've got to get out of here. And the inference is, when you want to move maybe one of your children along, you get your hand on the back of their elbow and you move them along. That's the inference of that. Didn't just actually grasp their hand. They got behind them to actually move them along, physically move them along to get them out. He lingered. Oh yes, he lingered. And the word lingered has the connotations still. He was still questioning, do we really have to do this? Is God going to do what you say he's going to do? Was it a simple question of total destruction? Was it sorrow of losing all he'd accumulated, because that's what is going to happen to him? Was it those things that paralysed him? And sometimes things do paralyse people, don't they? When there's an emergency, people are paralysed when they see the danger, but for some reason can't move. Because in the end, it was only God's mercy that saved him. He couldn't make up his mind where he wanted to go, where he needed to be. So God chose for him. God's grace was shown to him. I think we can probably put ourselves in that sort of position as well. Sometimes we make choices that are not good, and sometimes God lets us go with those choices, but other times he shows us a better way, and sometimes maybe even forcibly moves us in another direction. So, Lot and his family, his daughters, they flee Sodom. They're physically, like I say, taken out and immediately away from Sodom, and they're advised to flee. Don't loiter. Get out of here. up into the mountains. No loitering, no hankering for what's left. Flee to the safety that God directs. And that was the mountains. Who was up in the mountain? Abram was still up there, wasn't he? Abram, as we told later that morning, he got up and looked down to see what was happening. See if Lot was saved and if God had destroyed the place that he said. Genesis 19:17. As soon as they had brought them out, one of them said, "Flee for your lives. No looking back, just go. Don't stop anywhere in the plain. Flee to the mountains or you'll be swept away." The mountain where God directs. It was a place he'd originally come from, where he'd made that choice to move from. Now he's told to go back. He descended, hadn't he, from the mountain down to the valley, a very portrayal of his life. Now, one thing we should remember here for us, God's refuge is always sufficient. Man's alternative never is. So wherever God directs us is for our good, as it was for Lot. But what does Lot say? He says, that mountain's a bit too far and I'm tired. I didn't sleep last night, wondering what all was going on around me. I didn't sleep very well. I don't think I can make the mountains. I wouldn't get there before the destruction overtook us. He is now going down another path. Is he unconsciously minimising God's ability to ultimately save him? Or to strengthen him to go where God told him to go? I mean, if God had directed him to the mountain to flee there, which meant that you need the strength to get there if you're going to flee, it's not a walk, it's a fast walk at the slowest, then God would give him the strength to do it if God had directed him to go there. It's like God says, same sort of principle. He wants to give us the kingdom. And in his strength and by his grace, he will give us the kingdom. If God had physically taken Lot out, why then would he allow him to be overtaken by the destruction that he was going to bring? Because he was taking Lot out of that destruction. He only had to follow God's instructions. Take God at his word, for God is faithful as he has promised. Don't look back. Flee for your lives. And that's what he said. But no, my Lord, there's a small town just up the road. I haven't got much strength, but I think I'll be able to get there if you just hold off destroying the cities before I do. Look, here's a town near enough to run to. It's a small town, pretty insignificant. Let me flee to it. It's small, isn't it? Then my life will be spared. Small. It was still one of the cities of the plain. Did he think that city was any different in the way it treated other men and women than Sodom and Gomorrah was? I don't know. He made a choice. He made a choice, not the mountain that God had directed him to, but the city. The city he'd become accustomed to, with all its inherent problems, compared with his former life with Abram. So small, he mused, it's bound to be maybe not as godless as the others. And like I say, haven't got too far to go. I feel weak, I can't travel. So Lot's refuge, rather than being refuge in God, is another questionable city, not the one God offered. I think we've all heard this common saying, be careful what you ask for. He asked to go and he made the choice, and the angel didn't stop him because he made the choice, and God allowed it. God still saved him from the destruction of Zoar, but his life was destroyed in another way. 1 Corinthians 10:13. I'm quoting that because, as with Lot, any request made by God for us and the choice that we make, those choices may be granted to us even though they may not be the best for us. We might be advised by God to flee for the mountains, but if we choose another way, it may or may not be good for us. But in Corinthians 10, it tells us this: no temptation has seized you except what is common to man, and God is faithful, who will not let you be tempted above what you can bear. And this is the part. But when you are tempted, he will always provide a way out. Therefore, flee from idolatry. Now, we know if you flee from something, say it was a fire, you'd turn from it and you'd run as fast as you could if you were in the open, wouldn't you, to get away from it. So God is telling you is, any temptation that sees you, as it did with Lot there, to stay in the mountains, stay in the valley rather than the mountains, no different from any other person, but you've got to make a choice. The way is there to flee, but it's up to you to make the choice to take it. So he flees to this little town called Zoar. Zoar doesn't get destroyed as the other cities of the valley do. He gets to Zoar with his wife and 2 daughters. He enters the city, but behind him his wife lingers. And remember, the angels told him, don't linger, go. Lot's wife looks back. The pull of the places that she'd come from were too strong. She hadn't really left it, and she's punished with the other inhabitants. Jesus makes this point in Luke 17 about Lot's wife. He said, our eyes must always be on the ultimate safety of the kingdom. For once we've started on the journey of fleeing from those things that are ungodly, there is no turning back. Where our trust is, there will our heart be also. How long Lot and his daughters were in Zoar, we don't know. It is certain that he found the inhabitants were no different from those in Sodom. And maybe he saw them now for what they really were, unrepentant sinners. And it seems, this is just my take on it, that he may have told them why Sodom was destroyed and that you better change your godless ways. But all he got was rejection, and he certainly got anger against him, as though he was the cause of the Sodom and Gomorrah and the people they knew in that place were killed. We're told that he leaves in fear of his life. That tells me that they were certainly angry at him maybe trying to preach to them or whatever. What has happened now? He's lost all his goods, he's lost his house, long ago lost his herds, he's lost his wife. He's destitute apart from 2 daughters. What do you think his choice should have been? Now, wouldn't you think, rather than go and live in a cave halfway up the hill, wouldn't you think that he would have made the choice that Abram was up there on the top of the ridge just above the valley? Wouldn't you have thought that Lot would have made that choice and gone back, something in the sort of frame of mind of the prodigal son? And said, Abraham, up there waiting for him, waiting for Lot to appear over the top of the ridge and say, well, I made some bad choices, Abraham. Please take me back. But he didn't. He flees and lives in a cave in sight of the destruction. And the outcome of his choices are, and they stay with him the rest of his life. Because you know the story that eventuated in that, by living in that cave. He had 2 sons. And those 2 sons that were ever before him would show the indecisiveness and the way he compromised and the bad choices that he made were ever before his eyes. And so Lot disappears from Scripture. So did Lot act like Peter, or did he act like Judas? God's mercy is always there regardless of the choices that we make. Repentance brings a new perspective. And God's ear is always open to our cry. And his arm is always there to save. And regardless of those choices that Lot made, God still intervened in his life on quite a number of occasions, trying to get him to see that God was still there and all he had to do was turn and flee in the other direction. Did Lot use what God had set before him, being there to cry to and his arm to be lent on and save him? We don't know. So what do we have? We have a life of Lot, a mixture of good and bad choices. And a lot of those bad choices, he put himself in a position where the bad choices only engendered more bad choices. But as with all our decisions, they can and do have eternal ramifications for every single one of us. And sadly, the last thing we'll say, Lot's choices, his decisions, didn't always, and certainly not in the end, involve God. And that should be the thing that we take from Lot, that at all times we involve God in our choices.